Yeah, joined now by Ryan Nobles, NBC News. He covers the events on Capitol Hill. What was your principal takeaway?
Well, I think, Rich, it's important for your viewers to keep in mind the role that Congress plays in something like this, right? Mm-hmm. There isn't a lot that they can physically do to prevent this partnership or merger or whatever they're calling it from going forward. What they have is a bully pulpit and a platform. They can force people to come in front of them and answer tough questions. This is probably the sum total of what Congress is really going to be able to do to stand in the way of this merger going forward. And so what you saw here was, Democrats, particularly the chairman, Richard Blumenthal, asking some very pointed questions about where the funding was coming from, what type of influence the Saudi government specifically could have over the tour going forward, and then specifically how it's going to impact groups with a specific interest, most notably those 9/11 families. And so, I think they certainly put both Jimmy Dunn and the chief operating officer in tight positions where they're going to have to answer difficult questions. I'm sure the PGA officials knew that this was going to be a difficult day. Their goal was just to get through it, and I think they largely were able to do that.
Senator Blumenthal pretty much admonished the PGA Tour. He used very strong language, ending with a thought in his opening comments that the PGA Tour surrendered. Yeah. That's a very powerful word, surrendered, because of the money. Yeah. On the other hand, Senator Johnson, the Republican from Wisconsin, the ranking member on this committee, had a different approach. How so? Yeah,
and I really think this points back to Ron Johnson from Wisconsin's background as a businessman, right? He comes from the private business community, and one of the things he's done over the course of his career in the Senate is protect business interests and the ability for private business to operate without the heavy hand of government intervening. And his argument today was that the PGA found itself in kind of a hostile takeover situation, that they had no other option but to at least negotiate, otherwise they were going to be crushed. And his belief, and you also heard this from Rand Paul, who also kind of has more of a libertarian bent when it comes to these issues, that this isn't the government's responsibility to be involved in this. Unless they're specifically breaking a law, then Congress shouldn't be involved. You can have all the moral problems that you want with the Saudi government's role in all of this, and that's to be debated in the public sphere, and people can either walk away with their dollars and not attend these events and be involved in that way, but the government really doesn't have a role in preventing this from happening.
Was there an area in which Price and Dunn were somewhat weak in your estimation? And if so, where was that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the one area where I thought, and I think this will probably get played over and over again, is that they couldn't fully commit to this idea that they wouldn't institute some sort of disparagement clause that would require players to never say anything negative about the Saudi government in particular. They kept saying that their players would have the ability to speak their minds freely. They were never going to impede on that. But when specifically pressed, would you agree to a disparagement clause like that, they kept saying that they wouldn't advocate for it or they wouldn't recommend it. They wouldn't make that promise ultimately.
Jimmy Dunn, how effective was he on 9/11 when that came up?
I mean, I really believe that was perhaps the best person for the PGA Tour to put forward. One, at least according to his testimony, and you can't lie to Congress, he has no financial interest in this at all. Two, he has a very unique and special connection to the events of 9/11. Obviously, his company was hit very hard by that. He's helped to fund the scholarships of many of these 9/11 families. And he said very passionately that he would do nothing to help anyone that was involved in the 9/11 attacks. And the point he made was that he sees this as an opening to try and help the people of Saudi Arabia get exposed to something like golf, and perhaps that opens the door for more freedoms and human rights abilities for them down the road. I have to say that's probably met with some skepticism from those 9/11 families, many of which were in the room today, and I think from Senator Blumenthal as well. But he was very passionate at times, and I do think that resonated.
Senator Blumenthal indicated we're not done. What should we expect?
Well, I know for a fact, and the reporting that I've done, is that they really want to hear from live golf officials. They want to hear from people associated with the Saudi Investment Fund. The person they really want to hear from, and you probably understand that better than anyone, is Greg Norman, who's, of course, right now, at least the CEO of Live Golf. They did talk quite a bit about how whether or not Greg Norman's a part of the future of this negotiation. But Greg Norman was obviously the public face of this movement in the very beginning. He's someone who's a very prominent and well-known member of the golf community. I do think that Senator Blumenthal wants to ask him some tough questions about his role in all of this.
A long ways to go, but just your sense. If you look a year down the road, do you think a deal is done, they have a definitive agreement with the Public Investment Fund?
I mean, I really do believe Senator Johnson is correct, and Senator Paul as well, that I just do not see specifically what Congress can do to prevent it from going forward. What I do think probably happens here is that, you know, the one carrot or stick, depending on your perspective, that they have to play is the tax-exempt status of the PGA Tour, which is something that they obviously covet. I do think that that may lead to them having to put provisions into this agreement that the U.S. government feels more comfortable with going forward. But, you know, Rich, you understand this better than I do, but I find it hard to believe that there's anything that's really going to prevent this deal from going forward, at least from a government perspective.
How closely do you think other sports leagues were watching this today?
I mean, I think this issue of sports washing, the issue of investment by foreign entities, some that may have hostile intentions with the United States. It's not just Saudi Arabia. We heard China brought up here as well. I mean, if I'm the commissioner of the NFL, I'm wondering, does a Saudi Arabian-tied company want to buy an NFL franchise that's struggling? Obviously, I think tennis is another a sport that could be ripe for this kind of issue. You know, the PGA Tour is uniquely American, so that's why I think it's so focused here. But yeah, I do think that this is an issue that's not going to end here with golf.
Well, no legislation we think will, at least in the near term, come out of this. In all of your experience covering the events on Capitol Hill, did this rise to the level of national importance when all is said and done?
I mean, I think it will get a lot of attention today, and that's the purpose of this hearing. And it'll have to. I think a lot of this will depend on how the PGA Tour cooperates with Congress and when they ask these tough questions as to whether or not we'll see them brought out again for kind of this public flogging. As I said before, this is what Congress has the most ability to do. You know, what Congress has a unique ability to do is keep this in the public conversation. And I think if these members feel as though this negotiation is heading in a direction that they're not happy with, we're going to see them raise that again. I think that's possible.
You'll have a report tonight on NBC
NBC Nightly News. Yeah.
All right, Ryan Nobles of NBC News.